Good morning. It's good to see you. It's good to be with you this morning. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Job. The book of Job. We had just finished a class, a very excellent class on the book of Job that I really enjoyed, and I hope you did too. We went through the book of Job, and if you are not familiar with Job and Job's story, the devil comes to, the accuser comes to God, and God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And he says, basically the devil says, he only serves you because you give him stuff. And he says that if you take that stuff away, then he will no longer serve you. And God says, basically, you're on. Like, I have faith in my servant Job. And so the accuser takes everything from him, his kids, his house, his fortune, his livelihood, even his health, where he is sitting in ashes and he's just scraping his skin because he is so itchy and painful. And in the middle of the book, the main body is when him and his three friends, and eventually another friend comes up, and they're discussing why this is happening and really having a theological kind of discussion on why do bad things happen and what is the cause for it. And I think really in there, as we were going through the book of Job, there were several times in which Job questioned or thought or bemoaned or meditated on different things. And there was 4 specific questions that stood out to me. And they seem to be kind of the same questions that we all kind of at one time or another think about when we're going through something that's really excruciating, something that's a big trial, a big suffering in our life. Now, we may not go through the extent that Job did, but we understand, and I think we've all been there in some place or another, where we've lost our health, we've been slandered by other people. There's something that we lost in our life that we really loved and we really cared about, and it was suddenly gone. We went through that in our lives. And I think there's certain questions that pop up to mind when we go through that. And I'm not talking about like you're suffering like you missed lunch or something like that, but like when you really are in it and life seems pretty terrible. I think there are certain things that pop up into everyone's mind like it did Job. And so I just want to look at those 4 things and then what we can take from it. The first question, the first pondering that Job, that I want to look at is in Job chapter 9. Job chapter 9. And it starts in verse 32. Job chapter 9, verse 32. And Job is talking about God here. For Job 9, verse 32. For he is not a man as I am, that I may answer him, and that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter between us who may lay his hand on us both. Job says that he is nothing, he is not like me. He is so much bigger than me, he's so much more mighty than me. I'm just a human, and there is no arbiter, or some says mediator, that can go between us. That's what a mediator does, an arbiter does. When 2 parties have a dispute, there is someone in between to mediate that dispute. And I think it's really easy to think that God doesn't care about me. There's no way I can go before God. I think even in the toughest of times that we go through, it's very easy to think God is not looking out for me. He doesn't know what I'm going through. He doesn't know how I feel. He doesn't know how much I'm suffering. If only there was someone to go before him and let him know that. There were several times in the Psalms of various people in the Old Testament that had this kind of feeling. One was read at the Lord's Supper table in Psalm 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Before it was said by Jesus, it was said by David, and he felt that kind of forsaken, like he felt he was left. Another one is in Psalm 13, verses 1 through 3. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day by day my sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? God, like, where are you? I feel like you've totally left me. And in the midst of your suffering, it feels like he has totally left you and he doesn't know what's going on. If only there was a mediator, someone that could go in between. So I know that he hears me and he knows what's going on. And the answer to Job's question, as you'll probably sense a theme here, is in Jesus. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, it says, "For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for all, which is the testimony given at the proper time." There's one person that goes between man and God. There's one person. And he is the perfect mediator because, as Hebrews 4 says, we don't have a high priest that's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who is tempted in every way just as we are, and yet he did not sin. Therefore, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. We should have confidence that we know that no matter what we're going through, that God knows what is going on because we have a mediator. We have someone that is paying attention, that has went through the same kinds of things that we went through. He went through loss. He went through suffering. He went through slander, and he knows how it felt. And we have a go-between, an arbiter that is between us and God, someone that was God and human. We never again have to worry if God does not see or understand or feel like we're forsaken because Jesus is our mediator. He's our arbiter. The second thing that I see, the second question, is in Job chapter 14. Job chapter 14. This is the second question pondering that Job did. And I think that many people do in great times of suffering. Job chapter 14 and verse 7. "For there is hope for a tree. If it be cut down again, it will sprout again, and its shoots will not cease. Though its root grow old in the earth, and its stump die in the soil, yet the scent of water it will bud, and it put out its branches like a young plant. But a man dies, and it is laid low. A man breathes his last, and where is he?" And if you skip down to verse 14, it says, "If a man dies, shall he live again?" Job says there's hope for a tree. Because when a tree dies, when it's cut down, there could be a new sprout. It could be a new bloom. There's something that comes up again. But if a man is laid low, he just rests there and he turns to dust. Can he raise again? And oftentimes, in the Old Testament, most people didn't know that there was going to be a resurrection. Most people didn't know that there was going to be a life after this one. We have the exceptions being that Abraham and David and these great men who really were tight with God. They understood that there was something to come. But for the most part, most people in the Old Testament didn't know or didn't understand the full realization of the life to come. And we have that revealed to us today. So he says, is there a life after this one? Is there anything after this? And that's why he's so concerned about how people think of him, because how you lived on that day was through your children and through your name. And if all of his children died and his name was slandered by everyone because everybody thought he did something to deserve this, how would he live on? That's why we'll see in just a little bit how he wants his words to be carved in stone so that there'd be at least some recording of his innocence and the justice done to him. I would say that most people who suffer, especially if they are not Christian, they wonder, is there something after this? Is there something beyond this life? Because what I'm going through, there's got to be something, because if all there is just this life, then I got the sorry end of the stick because of what I'm going through. And again, I would say none of us have suffered to the extent that Job did, most likely, but in some part we have. We've been slandered. We've lost those who are dear to us. We've had our health taken away. There's been injustice done to us in some part. And so there is a question of, will there be justice at some point in time, even if it isn't in this lifetime? And the question is also answered in Jesus and his death and resurrection. Romans 8 puts it really well when it says, if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of the spirit who lives in you. So he's saying basically there will be a resurrection. There will be a new life. If Christ, who is the firstborn, was raised from the dead, we will be like him and raised from the dead also. But there will also be judgment. All things will be made right. Matthew 16, verse 27, it says, for the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. According to what each person has done, they will get their reward. And so there will be justice. God will make all things right. Even if you go through life and some form of injustice was done to you, and that is never made right your entire life, and the other person who did that to you, it seems like they got off scot-free, one day God will make everything right. I think especially in times of suffering, especially at the hand of someone else, we cry out, where is justice? Will God make all things right? And what we know is that God will. And there is a life after this one because of Jesus and his death and his resurrection, and then all things will be right. The third question that Job asks is in chapter 19, Job chapter 19. Beginning of this, he asked that his words would be written. But pay attention, verse 23, Job chapter 19, verse 23. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that they were in iron pen and lead, and that they were engraved in a rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. It's really kind of interesting that at this point in Job's words and speeches that there is so much uncertainty about God. At this point, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that he lives. And at last he will stand upon the earth. And I think that there is some form of desperation here. That what is happening is so unjust to me. Like, I didn't deserve what I've gotten. That something that has happened is so unjust that I know somebody will make it right. I know that my Redeemer lives and that he will stand up for me. We have a really good example of a Redeemer in Ruth and Boaz. Ruth and Boaz was a Redeemer for Ruth and Naomi. And what does a Redeemer do? A Redeemer takes care of and provides, but most importantly, takes up their case. Remember the whole incident at the gates of the city where Boaz takes up their case to make sure that their name doesn't die out? That's what a Redeemer does. It takes up their case and redeems them from their current state. And in 1 John chapter 2, it talks about the Redeemer that we have. It uses a different word, but it's kind of the same kind of thought. It says in 1 John chapter 2, verses 1, 2, my little children, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin. If anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And he is a propitiation for our sin, not for ours only, but for the sins of the entire world. We have someone that was an advocate for us, a redeemer, an attorney, as it were, who goes before God and speaks for us and speaks on our behalf. The difference between Jesus and a regular redeemer or attorney is if you're caught up in some legal case, someone sues you wrongly or something like that, and you have someone, an attorney, stand up for you and defend you, they don't serve the penalty themselves, do they? They don't take that and be like, okay, well, you did this, and so I'm just going to pay that. That would be some kind of attorney, wouldn't that be? But Jesus, he's not only the one that takes up our case, he also paid the debt from his blood, from himself. And so I know that my Redeemer lives. I think what Job, even though he may not know it, is very foreshadowing what Jesus would do. That his Redeemer would live, and that he would stand on the earth, and that he would plead Job's case, not just for what is going on, his suffering, but his sin. And that he would pay the price. Jesus is not just someone who pleads for us, but he paid the price for us. And we know that our Redeemer does live. That he lived and he died so that we can live once again. And then finally, the last question that we're going to look at. There's several. I just picked these four that seem to be common. In Job chapter 23, in Job chapter 23, starting in verse 2. Over and over throughout the whole speeches of Job, he never asked for anything but this. This is the only thing he ever really asked for. Job chapter 23, verse 2. Today also my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy on account of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know that he would answer me and understand and what he would say to me. Over and over, what Job asked for is to see God. He asked to see God, to meet him face to face, so that he can make his case before him. And what he's really asking for is for God to be accessible to him. That's what he's really asking for. And this is just one place, but like consistently throughout his speeches, he asks for this. And he bemoans, like, how can I reach him? I can go up to the tallest peaks, and he's far above that. There's no way I can go to lay my case before him. He is not accessible to me. And I think that it's easy for us to feel that too. Does God really care about what I'm going on through on this earth? Does he care about the minor things maybe that are greatly affecting me but are minor in comparison to the whole world? Can I really is he really accessible to me? I think it's this kind of thinking that makes John 1 verse 14 so amazing. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word, Jesus, became God, became flesh, and dwelt with us. And if you remember, that word dwelt means tabernacle. God became flesh and tabernacled with us. How accessible was the tabernacle? How accessible was God in the tabernacle? Not really. I mean, you have the Holy of Holies where one guy can go before there one time a year. And if you weren't born in the right family at the right time and got the lottery to go in, too bad. You're not going in before the Holy of Holies where God's presence was. And then you had the priest that could be in the temple itself, but if you weren't a priest, too bad. You couldn't be there if you weren't in the house of the line of Levi. And then outside there was a court for the male Jews, and then for the women, and then the Gentiles way above that. If you were not in, depending on who you were and what your family was and what your gender was, you could feel very far away from God. And then if you were unclean or you had anything wrong with you, you had to suffer outside of the temple. You couldn't even be in the temple. God felt inaccessible to people back then. But the God himself, the Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelt with us. How accessible was Jesus? He was so accessible that tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners could have dinner with him. He could eat with them and socialize and talk and hear him teach. He was so accessible that lepers and the diseased and people who had demonic spirits in them could touch him and he could heal them. He was so accessible that people hit him and spat upon him and eventually crucified him. He was super accessible. People could touch him. There was no barrier. There wasn't only certain people could come. Everyone could come and be with God and see God. He was super accessible. But that's not just only for us. That's not just only for them, but it's also for us. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 11, 1 John chapter 5, verse 12, it says, "This is the confidence that we have in approaching God, if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. If we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we asked of him." That because of what Jesus has done, and because of the confidence that we have to come before God's grace and mercy, as Hebrews 4 says, we know that whatever we ask, he hears us. We don't feel like he's inaccessible to us. He hears us, no matter where we are, who we are, whether we're of a great family or it seems like a terrible family. We know that he hears us. And that is a great blessing. But not only that, as 1 John 4 says, in the midst of suffering, we should see God in each other as well. He says, "Dear friends, since God loved us, we ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love made complete in us." When we're going through hard times and suffering, and we're going through things that are terrible in our lives, we should, the rest of us, especially if we're other members of church, we should be the kind of people to help those people be like Jesus was here on earth. So that through our actions, through what we say, through what we do, they see Jesus in us. And that his glory shines through us. It is so that we know when we're going through suffering, we know and we also feel that God is taking care of his people. Because it's not just a theoretical thing of us knowing it. It's also in the midst of suffering, it feels good to feel it, to know that he is there and that he will be there for us. If you haven't noticed the theme, the answer to Job's questions was Jesus. God doesn't answer all of Job's questions at the end. He doesn't answer a lot of them at the end, actually. But Job still asked those questions, and those are still recorded there for us. And I think one, so that we have an example, we have someone that we can empathize with. That when we're going through hard times, hey, Job struggled with this too. This great man of God that God said, there's my servant Job, who there's like no one like. He went through these same thoughts that we went through. But also as a foreshadowing to what great thing God would do in the future. And if Job could still be faithful and keep his faith, even though he knew nothing about who Jesus was and what God would do through Jesus, how much more should we keep our faith now that we know what Jesus has done for us? and everything that he's doing currently for us, how much more should we be faithful, even in the midst of great suffering? I hope that this has been an encouragement to you. I know either you're going through a hard time now, or you will probably in the future go through a hard time. It's just kind of how life is. But when you have these various questions come up where you doubt if God hears you, if you doubt he understands what's going on, you doubt there's really another world to come, or that he is really just and will make all things right, I urge you to look to Jesus, because he's the pinnacle of what God has done on earth. And we could take comfort in knowing that Jesus has done everything, went through everything we have, and he made it for us. And he's at the right hand of God mediating for us. We should take comfort in that. If we could do anything to help you, if we can help you in any way, if you would like to be baptized and enter into his kingdom, we'd love to help you with that. If we can do anything for you spiritually, come forward as we stand and sing.